want to talk about Reverend Swanson because I never see anybody talk about him, and I see him overlooked a lot in the fandom, and I do think that he's a very interesting character, and it kind of breaks my heart that nobody acknowledges him. I know, what could possibly be interesting about the camp morphine addict and alcoholic that lays around and does nothing for most of the game, but just listen. I'm not sure how many people are aware of this detail. I don't know if it's like a commonly understood thing in the fandom or not, but Reverend Swanson is one of the few people in the gang who are said to have saved Dutch's life. And I think that that's very interesting when you compare it to the majority of other people in this gang who are only there because they feel as if they owe their life to Dutch because he saved their life. But with Swanson, it's flipped. We don't know the details on how or what exactly happened, but we know that Swanson somehow saved Dutch's life, and Dutch feels extremely grateful to the Reverend for having done that for him. And I think that's a pretty explicit explanation as to why Swanson is even allowed to hang around in the gang. Yes, Uncle's also a lazy bastard, and we don't really know the details of how he got in the gang, but in Swanson's case, yeah, he's a nuisance, and he doesn't do anything, and he's not really contributing, at least at the beginning part of Red Dead Redemption 2, but Dutch doesn't really mind that, because I feel as if he thinks that he owes his life to Swanson, in reciprocation, so he gives Swanson all that he can, which is just people to run with, food, some kind of shelter or protection, because he knows Swanson can't really do all that on his own. I also just think it's very interesting when we consider that Dutch is not a religious person. In fact, pretty much nobody in the gang is religious. We do know that Javier still practices some forms of Catholicism, but pretty much nobody else in the gang is a religious person, and yet we have a reverend here with a gang of outlaws. It's just a really interesting dichotomy, especially, again, when you consider that Dutch himself is not a religious man, and he doesn't really seem to subscribe to any form of, worship, or he almost looks down upon it, I'd say. I'd even go so far as to say that he sees himself as God, and, that doesn't really go along with most religions. And yet, we have a, Protestant priest. It's just very interesting to have that guy mixed in with everybody else. But I do think that his presence there is an important one. Early on in the game of Red Dead 2, he's, again, a morphine addict, he's a drunkard, he's a nuisance, you have to go and save his life, and there's an air about the camp where people seem to feel as though he's annoying. They get aggravated with him being drunk and doing nothing all the time, and Dutch even will say that, hey, freeloaders, meaning, Reverend and Uncle, you need to start getting up off your ass and actually doing something. And we see Uncle to some degree do that, but Swanson never really does. But as the game progresses, he gets better, he starts to sober up, he starts to kind of come to his senses, and he really starts to reflect on what he's done and what he's going to do with his life. And I really do think that that's meant to sort of parallel Arthur's development. Now, this is kind of assuming we do, a high honor playthrough, of course, but I do think that his development in realizing he needs to fix himself, he needs to sort of stop everything that's holding him back in life and start doing something with it and becoming a better person, again, is supposed to kind of reflect the change that Arthur goes through himself. Obviously, there is a big difference between the two. Arthur was hurting other people pretty commonly, versus Swanson was only ever really harming himself. Drug abuse was something that hurt him, and it just kind of inconvenienced and annoyed everybody around him. So when it comes to, honor, morality, whatever you want to call it, Arthur had more, I would say, to reflect on and more to consider when it comes to all the bad that he did, and Swanson had less so. Not saying that recovery is easy, it's absolutely not, but, he had less change to really go through, I would say, when you compare to somebody who has been an outlaw for most of their life. But I do feel that his story is one of redemption also, so I do feel that it really goes in line with a lot of our protagonists in the games as well. He's somebody who lost absolutely everything that ever mattered to him, everything he cared for, and went down a dark path in life. He just happened to choose one that was self-harm instead of harm to others, and in the end, he ends up being a very successful priest out in New York. He goes through that path of redemption. I know he's super easy to overshadow and not really pay a lot of attention to because he's just one of those side characters, but I find his story very interesting, like I said, and I do think that it really parallels the story of our protagonist, and it goes along with the theme of redemption more than I would say most of the other characters do.